So we've been looking at rebel groups and kind of how they operate, and then by extension, once we understand how they operate, how we can understand how they can be defeated. And so as part of that conversation, I'd like to talk about rebel org behavior. So org behavior both in terms of how rebel groups are organized, and then also org behavior in terms of how that organization affects what the groups actually end up being able to do. And as part of that, I want to highlight that most civil wars do not involve just a single rebel group fighting a single state, that most of the time rebel groups are part of a big messy conglomeration, and rather than referring to a rebel group, we could refer to a rebel group as a single distinct hierarchical organization that's like carrying out military operations, but that rebel group is oftentimes part of a larger rebel movement, in which there's a series of groups, and they may be interlinked, and maybe they cooperate and coordinate for military operations, maybe they cooperate and coordinate for political purposes, they negotiate together as a bloc, or maybe they operate with just a very, very loose affiliation, maybe more of a network rather than some sort of hierarchy or formal relational structure. But a lot of times what we're dealing with in civil wars isn't a single group. It's multiple groups, better understood as a movement, because of the links among them. And we'll kind of talk about how that can be organized. And we care about the organization of these groups because that organization has huge implications for how groups negotiate peace agreements. I've done a little bit of work on this, looking at veto points and Civil War negotiations. And as the number of groups go up, you get changes in the number of concessions that states need to make and groups need to make to be able to demonstrate their effectiveness. We have some evidence that the more rebel groups are at the table, the harder it is to actually negotiate a successful peace agreement. So there's practical reasons why we care. There's some information, or there's some research that suggests that how groups are structured may impact how they interact with civilian populations, whether they're oppressive and brutal and commit atrocities, or whether they're largely working in a, I would say, positive but a non terrorizing way with the local population. And group organizational structure can affect whether the groups are able to adapt, whether they're able to change, whether they're able to respond and scale up. And there's a lot of implications for the evolution of groups that can be found in the organization of those groups at the local level, and then as they grow and build more complex organizational structures. By extension, once you understand sort of how groups are organized, that has implications for how they can be destroyed. And so people have looked at how to break up networks by targeting high intensity nodes. People have looked at centralization of groups and whether they're vulnerable to decapitation strikes where you hit the leadership. And a friend of mine, Mike Finley, has kind of posited this kind of relationship. I'll pull it up in a larger screen so we can kind of talk about it, where you can think about rebel group centralization on the x-axis as sort of going from not at all centralized, a very decentralized group, all the way to a very hierarchical group on the other end. And as the centralization of the group changes, the group's effectiveness changes as well, that a decentralized group may not be particularly effective in challenging a state. A highly centralized group might be more effective, but also might be more vulnerable to decapitation, whereas maybe some balance of decentralization to allow survivability against the state can allow for a group to survive while maintaining some level of operational effectiveness. And so again, I think thinking about these movements and how they're set up can be useful. I'll highlight two different ways that you can get hierarchical organization within groups. So one model would be, I guess, what you might call a unitary model, where the leadership has control over pretty much everything within the group. They make decisions about, when violence is used, where violence is used, how violence is used. They have, tight control over weapons, and that central leadership makes strategic decisions about how to extract resources from the population or from different illicit activities. And that central leadership is also responsible for carrying out recruiting, right? And so it's going to be a very top-down kind of model. You might think about the U.S. military as having a model, something like this, where there is a clear hierarchy, and you have sort of policy decisions being made by the U.S. government, and operational decisions being made by generals, and individual units not having wide degrees of latitude to kind of do their own thing. Whereas you could also have multi-divisional kind of hierarchies where you have maybe nominally a coordinating body at the top, but that coordinating body delegates out a lot of authority to subunits, and those subunits make those decisions about when they're going to launch an offensive and how they're going to use violence, and whether that violence is going to be used against civilians or against the state or against economic actors, and they're going to make decisions about how they finance themselves. In fact, they may be fully reliant on financing themselves, or they may be able to call upon resources from the central sort of coordinating body to maybe say, well, we're pushing a major offensive here on this front. Could we borrow fighters from a neighboring unit? And maybe the top command group would be able to help supply and support those kind of things. There's potential advantages to that kind of distributed network, as we'll talk about when we talk about some of the pros and cons of these different things. But before we get to that, I want to highlight a third way that rebel groups can structure themselves, and that's as networks, and sometimes described as dark networks because they're difficult to see because they operate sort of covertly or clandestinely. Also dark because that sort of implies sort of nefarious. But when we're thinking about networks, and this is something that David Kilcullen talks about when he talks about how to understand Al-Qaeda as a global network, he thinks, well, you have to focus on the nodes. And these are sort of self-directing units that are able to carry out operations. And so those nodes might be, sleeper cells that are based in the United States. The cell that attacked on 9/11 was sort of operating kind of independently and communicating back to folks in Afghanistan at maybe headquarters, but Al-Qaeda also had affiliates in the Philippines, and has developed different branch operations in the Arabian Peninsula and formed alliances with Boko Haram in Nigeria, and had a group that they were backing, the Nusra group in Syria. So there's all these different entities that are kind of doing things. Some of them are big, some of them are small, but they're linked together in different ways that allow for there to be communication across these groups. Sometimes resources can move between these groups. Sometimes the connections get cemented with marriage. That was something that Kilcullen notes is a strategy that Al-Qaeda does, is it uses marriage ties to kind of link people into the group and make those ties hold more strongly between groups. But then you also might have links to supporters. And so I think for a long time, Al-Qaeda ran sort of a flashy kind of color magazine, which was one of their main ways of communicating out with the larger world. Other groups use YouTube or different social media posts as a way to communicate out with the larger group. And actually that gets us thinking about this idea of the boundary, which is sort of the line between here's who's part of the network, and it's sort of tied together and sharing information or sharing resources, coordinating maybe, but each able to conduct its own operations, versus sort of the outside world. And networks need to be able to interact with the outside world because it's the outside world that's supplying in the inputs that they need. It's supplying in additional fighters, it's helping them build additional nodes, it's supplying guns and cash. And so paying attention to those boundary interactions of how those groups are able to draw in additional resources can help give you a sense about how to break those networks apart. Also thinking about how the nodes are organized, and if you can find sort of key communication nodes that link multiple different groups together and you can destroy those nodes, then suddenly the network becomes less able to operate and mobilize itself. So there's a whole research that's done on network analysis and how to appropriately target these kind of groups. But it's, again, I think one more way to think about how these groups can organize and be structured. And I should also flag that Kilcullen talks about how Al-Qaeda evolved over time, that initially it tried to be very much a hierarchical organization, but when it was sort of put under pressure by the United States after September 11th, it very much broke into a dark network, and that was how it sustained itself for a number of years when it had no place to operate openly. And then it evolved into what we might call that sort of multi-dimensional kind of structure or multi-divisional structure, where it had, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Nusra Front in Syria and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb in sort of North Africa. And so it had just like different affiliates that it was delegating out authority to help conduct operations. And how these groups organize has real implications. And again, I'll kind of pull this up to kind of talk through it a little bit more in detail. But if you have a unitary hierarchy, there's going to be really high governance costs. It takes a lot to be able to maintain that level of control, to make sure you know where the guns are, to make sure you know that you're vetting, every soldier that comes in appropriately. You're going to have a lot of your people and a lot of your resources in the organization doing oversight and monitoring, to the point where groups that do sort of hierarchical governance structure like the Taliban have essentially employee manuals and rule books to try to make people sort of conform to this larger structure. I'll throw up on our Blackboard course the Taliban sort of handbook for Taliban fighters that was compiled by the Taliban to help support their operations. It was seized in a raid. But this sort of highlights how much attention has to be paid to trying to control what subunit leaders are doing. But if you do it correctly, you can have very high effectiveness, because information moves very efficiently through that organization so that it gets to all the various different places in the organization that it needs to go. Information goes up, it's shared horizontally. You get unit leaders that know each other, that know how to coordinate, that are all trained and conduct operations in similar ways, and that can make for very effective military units. Multi-divisional hierarchies have the benefit that you can sort of basically say, okay, you can govern this chunk of territory, and you can govern this chunk of territory, and sort of spin off new divisions as to prevent your coordination and governance costs from having to go up. So essentially, you're able to scale very quickly into these different areas, but getting those different groups to work together becomes very difficult, particularly because those other groups may not have any coordination with each other at all. And so while Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula may coordinate somewhat with the Al-Qaeda leadership, they certainly aren't coordinating with each other in that way, unless the Al-Qaeda leadership kind of links them together. And so that limits the flow of information, and it limits the ability of groups to support each other. It also means that subunit leaders may be doing their own thing, that because they're not sort of tied into a unified command structure, they may have their own priorities, they may respond to the situation that they're in very different ways. And so we see in some cases, I think in Peru with Shining Path, you get one branch of the organization that pursues working with the population and trying to mobilize the population and tax the population in a way that kind of looks like state building, and another faction that's sort of operating independently, one of these subunits, essentially goes all in on drug trafficking, and that's their mechanism of financing their operations. So you can get different kinds of patterns emerging with how these groups are structured. And with networks, I mean, again, you have minimal governance costs, and that's great. It's maybe a important organizational tool when a group is under incredible pressure. Certainly after Al-Qaeda in Iraq had to go underground before it reemerged as ISIS, it was essentially defeated and survived as a network of people who kind of knew each other and maintained contact and started planning and plotting for how to rebuild the organization. But that process of planning requires information to kind of diffuse out from one node to another, and can be very hard to build coordination across the entire network. And you really do run into problems of different subgroup leaders really having their own private interests. That yes, you're part of this network, but your day-to-day of what you're doing is oftentimes going to be more pressing than the larger needs of the network to be able to accomplish specific tasks. So how these groups are structured really can affect what they're able to do, how well they're able to coordinate, and how you're able to target them. And it's worth recognizing that groups can change and evolve as they encounter different environments. And then lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit, very briefly, about why we see so much fracturing among rebel groups and what explains that. And so we have a couple different explanations that we've encountered so far in this course, but we'll talk about some additional ones going forward. So one reason is just resources. And Weinstein talks a lot about this idea of rebel group command and control, and how when rebel groups have access to, diamonds, or have access to opium, or something that can bring in large quantities of cash very quickly, it allows for the groups to scale very quickly, and they oftentimes don't have the ability or even the need really to build strong command and control structures. And so they oftentimes build very loose command structures, and that can leave groups open to subunits doing their own thing. It can lead to units not following sort of the directives coming down. It can create all sorts of governance problems. It can lead to splintering. Marsh tells a similar kind of story, but his focus is on guns, and we'll encounter his article a little bit later. But he tells a story where when guns are really scarce within a rebel movement, the leadership maintains really tight control over those guns and makes determinations about where they're going to be used and how they're going to be used. Whereas if guns are sort of awash in society, then you build your rebel movement by telling people to bring their own gun. And if people are bringing their own guns, they have there's not a lever that the leadership can use to kind of control and direct what those units are doing. So you get splintering and fractionalization, and you can have rebel groups essentially turn into rebel movements in which you have, essentially small gangs that are conducting operations without any coordination at all, because there's 12 people and they have guns. You can get groups breaking apart due to political divisions. We sometimes call this splintering. Oftentimes negotiations have this effect that you'll have a negotiation with the state, and there'll be a deal that will be worked out, and one faction within the group will say, yes, we're going to take that deal, and another faction says no, and so the group suddenly breaks apart, and now there's a hardline faction and a more moderate faction. We saw this happen with the IRA when they negotiated the Good Friday Accords. I think the IRA sort of splintered into the IRA and the real IRA. We see this in other places as well. The inability to communicate can lead to fracturing of groups. Again, this is Kilcullen's thesis with what happened to Al-Qaeda, that they tried to do a unitary command structure, and then when the United States put the screws to the group after September 11th, they weren't able to use their regular communication channels. Their money laundering channels were shut down, and so they had to kind of go underground into a network, and that led to fracturing and splintering, and they were only able to rebuild as a more divided sort of regionally based organization. And then a final source of why we see this kind of fracturing of groups is just geographic separation. And oftentimes when there's clear geographic divisions, you can get just almost like a natural strategic decision of groups, or just a natural sort of process from below of creating separate rebel groups. And so in Sri Lanka, the command structure ended up bifurcating between sort of the north and I think the west of the country, with the Tamil Tigers operating sort of two parallel organizations. Those two parallel organizations eventually kind of broke and went in different directions, with a commander in the west deciding that he wasn't going to continue supporting the Tamil group in the north. So that kind of geographic division can facilitate splitting. Sometimes it's just a necessity. So I can flag in Palestine, where you have the West Bank and you have the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank has historically been the stronghold of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which became the Palestinian Authority, and then Fatah as the political party behind that. And then in the Gaza Strip, you had Hamas being much more prominent and eventually able to sort of seize control of the Gaza Strip and become the main group that was active and dominant in that space. And the fact that they're geographically distinct and separate, I think, helps facilitate that and helps explain why you would get different rebel groups coming to dominate in those different spaces.